Hey guys, tonight we slip back into scratchy linen shifts, step barefoot onto rush-strewn floors, and squint into the dim, pre-dawn light of a medieval cottage. You're a woman in a world without alarm clocks, but make no mistake, you're already behind schedule. The rooster's crow hasn't even sounded, but your day is about to begin, and it won't slow down until long after the hearth fire dims. There's a jug of water near your cot, cold, as always. You splash your face, careful not to wake the children still curled together like bundled laundry on the straw-stuffed mattress. You envy them, just a little. Sleep clings to them like warm fog. For you, though, rest is a luxury best left to saints and nobility. You've got barley to grind, animals to tend, and dough to start before sunrise. See, sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just about rest. It was entangled in class, gender, and even sin. And if you were a woman, well, you probably weren't getting your 8 hours. In fact, your sleep schedule would make a modern insomniac look like a nap enthusiast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You creak open the wooden door, morning mist seeps in, and so does the chill. Your breath fogs, even inside. This isn't the Middle Ages as romantic paintings promised. There are no harp songs, no lazy mornings wrapped in velvet. What you get instead is a day carved out of duty and damp wood. You head to the hearth, throw a few coals from yesterday into a handful of dry moss, and blow. Smoke rises slowly. Your fingers are already stiff. Medieval women lived lives that rotated around everyone else's needs. Their rest, when it came, was fragmented and conditional. If you were lucky, you had a sliver of mattress to call your own. If not, you shared a sleeping space with relatives, neighbors, even livestock, depending on how cramped your house was. Most nights, you'd collapse early but not deeply. You sleep with one ear tuned to the child coughing in the dark, the goat rustling nearby, or the creeping anxiety that someone in your house has lice again, and you wouldn't sleep straight through the night. Either. Medieval sleep often came in 2 segments, divided by a quiet, wakeful hour. Historians still argue whether this first sleep and second sleep were universal or more common among specific regions or classes. Either way, for you, that in-between hour is filled with anxiety, muttering prayers, checking on coals, or just lying there, trying not to itch. During daylight, you're expected to hold it together. You're up before the men and down after them. Your hands are always busy kneading, sewing, stirring, scraping. If you take a moment to rest, it had better be in prayer. And even then, don't nod off in church. That might be read as sloth or worse, as spiritual weakness. The church, you see, had plenty to say about women and sleep. It praised saints who went without it, and accused dozing nuns of being flirtatious with Satan. There's one story of a medieval abbess who allegedly kept her sisters awake through the night to ensure none were tempted into dreams of earthly pleasures, and the idea stuck. Women who slept too much were lazy, vain, or morally suspect. You think about this as you wrap your shawl tighter around your shoulders. The loaf is in the oven now, and the fire has finally warmed your fingers. It's still early. You allow yourself to sit. Just for a moment, the cat slinks across your lap. The baby stirs, your husband still asleep. Of course, the irony is thick enough to chew, and while the nobles may have had feather beds and curtains, don't assume they slept better. The expectations placed on noble women: politeness, availability, political poise made rest just as slippery. Their routines were scheduled down to the minute. They were never alone, even in bed. Servants hovered, duties called, candles flickered late into the night over embroidery hoops and whispered gossip. You, at least, have the stars and the wind that comes through the thatch. You can almost hear it hum. It's a strange comfort, this ancient kind of insomnia. At least you're not alone in it. Your neighbor is likely awake, too, grinding her own flour in the cold dark. And that's the thing about sleep. In the medieval world, it wasn't a guaranteed escape. It was often one more battlefield where women were expected to be quiet, small, and useful, even when unconscious. Still, as the dough begins to rise and the sun peeks over the trees, you feel a strange satisfaction. You've survived another night, another dawn. You haven't rested properly in years, but somehow you're still going. Tomorrow, it'll be the same, and the day after that. You may not have had a choice in your bedtime or wake-up call, but you've mastered the art of resting with one eye open and finding small comfort in the stillness of the hours no one else notices. And now the baby's really up, which means you're up too. You carry the baby on one hip, sway gently as you stir the morning pot, and try not to think about the fact that you haven't slept more than 4 hours in a row in years. You hum a little tune under your breath, not for cheer, but to stay awake. This is your world shaped by exhaustion, expectation, and the constant threat of being seen as too much, too slow, too loud, too tired. As the stew bubbles, you glance at the door. It's not the baby that makes your stomach tighten, it's the knock that might come. You see, it's not just sleep that's denied to you. It's peace. In the Middle Ages, being a woman meant existing in a low-grade state of fear, and nowhere was that more terrifying than in the realm of accusation and punishment. Let's say, for instance, that your neighbor suspects you of casting the evil eye. Maybe her cow got sick, or her baby won't sleep. She starts whispering, other women nod, and suddenly, you're no longer just exhausted, you're dangerous. The village priest is called in. His gaze lingers a little too long, searching for signs that you're not quite right. That's how fast it could turn. You could go from peasant mother to possible witch in the time it takes for a chicken to stop laying eggs. You know about the punishments. Everyone does. They're spoken about in hushed voices, never during the day, always by firelight. They involve things like public shaming, binding, dunking, walking naked through town. And if you're lucky, that's all you get. Historians still argue whether medieval witch trials were more about superstition or social control. Either way, the results were the same: women, tired and poor, suffering for things they didn't do and couldn't prove they didn't do. Let's talk about one of the more creative tortures, the scold's bridle, a delightful contraption, essentially a metal cage that locked over your head, with a tongue plate jammed in your mouth to keep you from speaking. Not just humiliating, but painful. The idea was to stop women from gossiping, nagging, or speaking in general. Kind of a medieval mute button, except it came with rust and drool. If you were marched through town in one of those, it didn't matter what you'd actually done. The shame alone would follow you forever. Women were often the targets of these punishments for violating social norms, not laws, talk too much, cry too loud, push back against your husband. And suddenly, you're wearing a cage in the market square while children laugh and throw stones. Meanwhile, if a man beat his wife, that was discipline. Domestic abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. There's an old legal phrase, chilling in its matter-of-factness rule of thumb. While the exact origins are debated, the myth persists that it referred to the maximum width of a stick a man could use to beat his wife. Scholars still argue whether that phrase was truly codified law or folklore, but the underlying truth remains: violence against women was normalized. Your mother probably warned you about it. Her mother, too. Marriage wasn't a safe haven, it was a gamble. If your husband was kind, you might survive. If he wasn't, you had few options. Divorce, unthinkable. Running away, maybe, but where would you go? And even if you escaped, you'd still be labeled a disgrace. Some women turned to the church for shelter. Convents offered protection and a kind of twisted peace, but even there, the rules were suffocating. Wake at 2 a.m. for prayers, sleep on a wooden board, never speak unless spoken to. You traded one prison for another, but at least this one didn't come with fists or metal bridles. And let's not forget the punishments that came cloaked in medical justification. Hysteria, for example, was a common diagnosis for women who dared to be emotional, outspoken, or resistant. The cure, well, that's a long, strange road involving everything from herbs to bizarre rituals involving smoke and chanting. You remember hearing once about women who were made to sit over smoldering herbs to expel the demon of sleeplessness? Spoiler, it didn't work. You adjust the baby on your hip again. He's drooling now, gurgling a little. You bounce gently, and your mind wanders to another tale. The ducking stool, another medieval innovation designed with a sharp mix of cruelty and showmanship. Imagine being strapped to a plank and dunked repeatedly into freezing river water, all because someone said you were argumentative, or worse, unmarried and outspoken. There's one record of a woman being ducked for speaking foul words to her husband. Foul words. No one recorded what those words were, but they must have been legendary to merit a hypothermic bath in front of half the village. Sometimes you wonder if silence is the only way to survive, but then you remember the women who didn't stay silent, the ones who shouted back. Some were punished, yes, but some were remembered. Saints, rebels, healers. You whisper their names when no one's listening, like spells. You return to your pot and stir. The sun is fully up now, and the village is moving. Footsteps crunch outside. A rooster crows late, as usual. You think about your neighbor, the one who talks too much and doesn't care who hears. She's still alive, still talking. And maybe, just maybe, that's its own kind of resistance. The fire crackles low as dust creeps across the edge of your cottage wall, and you lay the baby down on straw that's slightly less itchy than usual. For once, he doesn't fuss. You almost dare to believe you'll get a full hour to yourself, not to rest. Of course, just to think, to feel something other than tired. But even thought isn't always safe, especially for women, especially now. You lean against the wooden frame of your doorway and remember the old woman from 2 cottages over. She used to mumble to herself, pluck herbs from the hedgerows, and stir things in pots that weren't soup. The kids said she was a witch, but you knew better. She was just old and clever and alone. Still, when her neighbor's son fell sick, it only took 3 whispered words. She cursed him for the town to act. They didn't need proof, just a mob, a rope, and the confidence of men who thought they were doing God's work. You blink slowly, watching dust spin through the golden light like floating embers. In those moments between chores, between exhaustion and dark, you can almost taste the ache of all the women who came before you. Women punished not just for what they did, but for who they were, how they looked, what they made others feel. Let's talk about trial by ordeal. Ah yes, the medieval justice system's version of let's see if the universe likes you today. One popular favorite, the ordeal by water. A woman accused of witchcraft would be tied up and thrown into a river or pond. If she floated, she was guilty and burned or hanged. If she sank, she was innocent but drowned. Not exactly a win-win. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic rituals or genuine beliefs in divine judgment. Either way, they were deadly theater performed in public, complete with jeering crowds and clergy chanting nearby. Justice was less about truth and more about spectacle. Then there was the ordeal by hot iron. The accused would carry a red-hot bar of metal a set number of paces. Her hand would be bandaged, and after 3 days, the wound would be inspected, healed cleanly, innocent, infected or blistered, guilty. Science, medieval style. You rub your palm absent-mindedly, imagining the heat of that iron bar, imagining being forced to hold it while everyone stared. waiting, judging, smiling. There's a strange logic to how women were tested impossible standards set by men who rarely faced them. You weren't just supposed to be obedient and quiet. You had to be lucky too, lucky enough not to anger your husband, your priest, your neighbor, or some noble's bored wife who decided your eyes were too knowing. And don't think the upper class had it much easier. Sure, noble women had nicer gowns and sometimes even feather-stuffed beds, but power didn't buy safety. If anything, it made things more precarious. Court intrigue was like a game of chess played with poison pawns. One wrong alliance, one misunderstood smile, and suddenly you're accused of treason or worse. Adultery. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of two different kingdoms, mother to kings, sharp as a dagger, and yet imprisoned by her husband for supporting her sons in rebellion. No cage was too small for a woman with influence. Anne Boleyn. You've probably heard of her. Charming, educated, politically savvy, and eventually headless. Historians still argue whether she was truly guilty of anything at all, or whether she simply became inconvenient. You glance again at the baby, his little fingers twitch in sleep, grasping for dreams. You hope he'll grow into a world where women don't have to walk barefoot over glowing coals to prove their worth. But even as you hope, you know that history is stubborn. It doesn't forget its favorite tricks. You sigh and think about the pillory. It sounds almost pleasant, like a flower or a dessert, but no. It's the wooden frame with holes for your head and arms, set up in the middle of town. Another public punishment, another humiliation. People would gather to jeer, throw things, sometimes worse. You'd stand there for hours or days, unable to move, your joints aching, your pride shattered. Women got the pillory for all kinds of reasons: petty theft, gossip, moral offenses. One woman was sentenced after arguing with her husband in public, another for selling bread that was too small. Yes, really, that's a crime when you're female and poor, and no one helped you. If they did, they might end up right beside you. You sit down on a worn stool, bone-tired, and press your cheek to the table. The wood is cool and smells faintly of old onions and smoke. Your eyelids flutter, heavy as bricks. The baby stirs, but not enough to cry. For now, you're allowed this moment. Outside, the world keeps turning. The stars begin their slow dance, the same ones that watched over hundreds of years of women just like you, accused, punished, forgotten. But you're still here, and you're listening. Your cheek lifts gently from the rough wooden table as the chill from a drifting breeze nudges your neck. You groggily straighten up, fingers aching from clenching the edge of the bench in your sleep. That's the thing about trying to rest in this world. It's never uninterrupted, and certainly never peaceful, because rest, like safety, is a luxury you haven't quite earned. And speaking of luxury, or rather, its twisted opposite, let's wander into the world of sleep deprivation as punishment. Yes, you read that right. They found ways to make not sleeping even more miserable than the daily grind already was. Imagine being tied upright in a cold stone chamber, your arms and legs suspended just enough to keep you from full collapse. Every time you drift off, someone, usually a priest or soldier, shakes you awake or strikes you lightly, over and over, for hours, for days, until your mind detaches, your thoughts fragment, and you forget your own name. They called it vigil torture. And it wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a mental one. 2, women accused of witchcraft were often questioned this way, not tortured. Mind you, no, that was illegal in some regions, but kept awake for clarity, because apparently hallucinations count as confession. Historians still argue whether this form of interrogation actually produced useful information or simply coerced stories that mirrored popular fears. Midnight Sabbaths, baby sacrificing, shape-shifting into cats. You know, the usual bedtime material. You shiver, not because of the cold, but because this wasn't just rare, it was systematized. Entire manuals described how to deprive the accused of sleep just enough to keep them barely conscious. Leibspiels. One German text even suggested alternating cold baths and loud noises. Think medieval boot camp meets haunted house. But let's step away from the dungeon for a moment and back into your own modest world. You know sleep deprivation well, just not as a punishment with chains. For you, it's the squalling baby, the sick goat, the surprise church feast you're meant to cater from 3 leftover cabbages and prayer. And maybe that's the cruelest twist. Your daily reality resembles sanctioned torture, and no one's even mad about it. They just call it a woman's work. You stifle a laugh. If only they knew how often you've nodded off while stirring gruel, or how many times your dreams started with the sound of your own name, shouted by someone needing something. In a weird way, your exhaustion has made you fluent in micro-naps, half-lucid reasoning, and the art of standing while sleeping. But imagine adding public shame to that mix. Let's talk about scolds bridles. Yes, it sounds like something for a naughty pony, but really, it was for a naughty woman, meaning someone who spoke too freely, too sharply, or simply too often. The bridle was a metal cage placed over your head, often with a plate that pressed down on your tongue. Sometimes it was spiked, so if you moved your mouth too much, say, to breathe or scream, it would pierce you. Crafted from iron and humiliation, the bridle was paraded through villages with the wearer leashed like livestock. In some towns, bells were added so people could hear the shame coming. It's easy to imagine the children giggling, the adults sneering, the guards not quite looking you in the eye. One woman in Scotland wore hers for an entire day because she insulted the church baker. Another in England was accused of quarreling with a constable's wife. Not fighting, not harming, just arguing. Medieval Yelp didn't tolerate negative reviews. Historians still argue whether the bridle was purely punitive or a form of public silencing meant to reinforce hierarchy. Likely both. In either case, it turned everyday women into cautionary tales. And it worked. Because even now, hundreds of years later, you sometimes catch yourself biting back a comment, choosing quiet instead of truth. The echo of that bridle still rattles down time like the ghost of a bell. You sigh and reach for a crust of bread, chewing it slowly as your jaw clicks in quiet protest. Not pain, just wear and age and time. You imagine what it would feel like to have a rusted cage pressed against your face, how heavy it would be, how dehumanizing. Now, let's not forget the ducking stool, another crowd favorite. The accused, usually women labeled as nags, scolds, or witches, would be strapped into a chair at the end of a long lever, then dunked repeatedly into a river or pond, soaking them until they confessed or passed out. It was part punishment, part entertainment, a community event. Children cheered, vendors sold pies, justice served with a side of laughter. One woman was ducked for arguing with her neighbor over chickens, another for refusing to attend church after her husband died, yet another for simply being disagreeable. Disagreeable. You chew that word like it's gristle. It covers so much, doesn't it? Too smart, too mouthy, too tired to smile, and yet you're supposed to smile. There's one more torture you've felt in your bones, even if no one ever called it that: enforced stillness. No opinions, no dissent, no dreams outside your station, just quiet compliance. It's not a device or an iron tool, it's just the silence that follows your voice being ignored. Tonight, as the stars lean in through your tiny window and the wind sighs against the shutters, you wonder how many women sat just like this, how many blinked through exhaustion and bit back screams and tried, however faintly, to remember what freedom used to feel like. Maybe you'll never know their names. Maybe their stories were never inked onto parchment or carved into stone. But you can still feel them, curled between the splinters of the floorboards, resting in the soot-black corners of the hearth. And maybe, just maybe, that means they're not quite gone. Your eyes adjust to the thin pre-dawn light leaking through the shutters, casting long fingers across the uneven floor. You haven't really slept, Again, the dreams that do come are jagged, half memory, half warning, and they vanish like breath on glass the moment you try to recall them. But that's fitting, isn't it? Because the night is never truly restful when you carry the weight of invisible rules. Not the written kind, no. These are the expectations stitched into every interaction, every glance, every silence that lasts 1 second too long. You blink slowly, flexing fingers that feel older than you are. Let's talk about the rules you're born into, the ones that decide what you wear, how you walk, when you speak, but also how you're punished if you stray even slightly outside the lines, because we haven't yet explored the punishment for merely existing the wrong way. Picture this. It's the 14th century, and you're living in sin. That could mean many things: unwed pregnancy, extramarital flirtation, even just wearing clothes deemed too fine for your status. The church loved to categorize, and the town loved to enforce. So what happens? You're marched to the center of the village in a shift, no cloak, no shoes. Sometimes they shave your head, not for hygiene, for shame, for visibility. You're not a person, you're a living warning label. In many places, your penance includes walking a prescribed route, barefoot in winter, reciting prayers aloud while villagers jeer. If you cry, you're weak. If you don't, you're defiant. Either way, someone writes it down, and maybe you think that's the end of it, a one-time spectacle, a public penance paid in full. But no, this is the Middle Ages. Sweetheart, your reputation doesn't get a second chance. For months, even years, you're referred to not by name, but by deed. The whore of Wednesday, they call you, or that girl with the frostbitten feet, a title earned in silence and never lost. Historians still argue whether the purpose of public penance was spiritual redemption or simply control through humiliation. It's likely both, a bit of salvation wrapped in social terror. And sometimes, brace for this, it came with applause. No, really, in certain Spanish towns, if a woman confessed to moral failings and did her penance well-meaning meekly, tearfully, visibly, the church awarded her with food or coin, like a moral tip jar. You get the distinct feeling that piety was being gamified. But what happens when you refuse, when you decide shame isn't your flavor, when you simply walk away? Let me introduce you to the forest. Not the romantic kind with elves and fairies. No, this forest is cold, wet, and merciless. It becomes home to women who are banished, not formally executed, but left to starve or freeze beyond the town limits, sometimes for crimes, often for rumors. In many regions, forest women are a known archetype. Maybe you've seen one: wild hair, wary eyes, hands too calloused for someone so young. She's not a witch. Not really. She's just the end result of social overflow. Too many punishments, not enough prisons. The system's quiet way of saying go disappear. And here's a tidbit you won't hear in school: some of those women became informants, spies. They returned under false names to pass messages between rival lords or rebel factions, sleeping in haylofts by day, listening through shutters by night. One record mentions a woman known only as Grey Mare, who helped foil a noble assassination attempt by sneaking a message into a tapestry. Historians still argue whether she was real or legendary, but isn't that always the case with women who vanish? They either become myth or footnote. Meanwhile, inside the village walls, even compliant women walk a tightrope. One misstep and you're out. But what counts as a misstep? Sometimes it's too much laughter. Other times, it's knowing how to read. Yes, let's talk about that. In the 13th century, female literacy was not forbidden, but it was, let's say, monitored. Especially if you were not cloistered. Monks could read, noble women, too, but only certain texts, devotional ones, not romance, definitely not philosophy. You find a scrap of parchment behind the bread bin one morning, a discarded psalm, maybe, or a piece of a merchant's list. You can't help reading it. It feels like holding a secret inside your skull, dangerous and delicious. And if you're caught, well, you wouldn't be tortured, at least not officially, but the baker might stop selling to you. The washerwomen whisper. The priest preaches on feminine vanity with extra eye contact. That's the thing about punishment. It doesn't always leave marks. Sometimes it just leaves space where warmth used to be. You think of Agnes, your neighbor's cousin. She used to write prayers in the margins of her Bible, just initials, really, decorative ones. Then one day she was gone. They said she went to help a distant uncle. You doubted, because a few weeks later, the priest started warning against women who fancy themselves scribes. Subtle, right, but there's always one woman who pushes further, like the midwife who kept track of herbal mixtures in a coded journal, not for magic, just for memory. She was burned, not for witchcraft, technically for unlicensed healing. A loophole, paper thin. Her journal vanished, but sometimes you dream about it, pages filled with root drawings, blood notes, lunar scribbles. A woman's mind, pressed into vellum, preserved, alive. So you sit by the fire now, thread in hand, weaving a pattern into your apron hem that looks like decoration, but maybe it's a prayer, or a recipe, or a map. The line between art and rebellion is razor thin, after all, and every stitch matters. The sun's just rising now, a pale smear behind clouds, and you're already at work. Not by choice, obviously, nobody asks. There's bread to knead, water to haul, chamber pots to empty. You're not heroic, you're just busy, perpetually. Today it's laundry again, scrubbing coarse wool garments against stone, your fingers raw and pink in the icy stream. The water doesn't just numb your skin, it numbs your sense of time. Minutes blend into each other like the lather on your apron. You think about sleep, the sleep you didn't get, and how strange it is that no one seems to care how tired you always are. Rest is a luxury for the land-owning or the dead, and you're very much neither. But there is something darker running underneath today's routine fear, because today's not just laundry day, it's market day. And the market means men. See, in your town, markets are technically open to all, but in practice, they're ruled by merchants, guildsmen, and clerics, and you're none of those things. You're a woman, which means if you sell something, it better be eggs, and if you speak too loudly, it better be praise, and heaven forbid you bargain. Because here's a bitter fact you've swallowed often: if a woman negotiates, she's difficult. If a man haggles, he's shrewd. So you underprice, you smile, you bow your head, and still, one of them mutters, "She's too proud for a washer's daughter. You can't win. You're not supposed to." But today's market has another flavor judgment, because this week, a widow named Beata dared to argue with the tax collector, not even about her own taxes, about her neighbors. She said they were unfair. She said it publicly. Beata isn't at market today, but her name is. It floats through the air like wood smoke. People whisper it in fragments. Her tongue, too sharp. She read something from a letter. They'll try her. You freeze, because try doesn't always mean a courtroom. And for a woman, it almost never means justice. Let's say this plainly, in much of medieval Europe, trials weren't about truth. They were about proving suffering. Sometimes it was trial by water. They'd bind your wrists and throw you into a river. If you floated, you were guilty, rejected by the pure water. If you sank, you were innocent, also possibly dead. So, win-win historians still argue whether this method was ever taken seriously by the educated elite, or if it was more of a crowd-pleaser public theater dressed up in divine logic. Either way, people clapped, and it wasn't always about guilt or innocence. Sometimes, the trial was just spectacle, like Beata's might be. You glance around, half expecting to see the village bailiff hauling a woman through the mud, robes soaked, eyes blank with resignation, but the square is quiet, too quiet. Because fear, when it's fresh, doesn't scream, it whispers, it tiptoes, it soaks into the stones under your feet until even your footsteps feel too loud. Still, people show up, they always do. There's meat to buy, gossip to trade, and lurking at the back of the butcher's stall is something new, a wooden chair with strange metal clamps on its arms. You pretend not to see it, but you do. They say it's for questioning, not torture, just persuasion. Let's talk about that, shall we? The interrogation chair wasn't always studded with spikes. Sometimes it was plain wood, cold, unyielding. Its cruelty came from duration. You'd be tied to it for hours, sometimes days, while officials demanded confessions. Not loudly, not violently, just endlessly. Eventually, your joints locked, your legs went numb, your mind followed. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about endurance. Could you outlast discomfort? Could you stay human when treated like furniture? There's a story of a woman named Catalina in Bruges who sat for 3 days straight, didn't speak, didn't cry. On the fourth day, they declared her a demon, not for what she said, but for what she withstood. And the punishment for demons. Not a fair hearing. Fire. Historians still argue whether she ever existed. Her name shows up in 2 accounts, both secondhand, but her story persists. You don't forget the image of a woman reduced to silence and then punished for being silent, so you keep your voice soft. You sell your eggs, you nod too much, but your mind wanders. You imagine Beata not bound, not judged, but standing tall on a hillside, yelling into the wind about fairness, about mercy, a wild vision, but strangely comforting. And while you daydream, your friend Marin sidles up with a basket of herbs and a look you've seen before, concern dressed in gossip. They're saying she spoke Latin. Marin murmurs. You blink, because Latin, that's priest territory, scribe territory. Certainly not Beata's, where you whisper, a letter, her dead husband's. She read it aloud, said it proved the tax was forged. That's all it would take. Not even the content, just the reading. You feel a chill wrap itself around your spine, because you've read too. You've peered at scribbled psalms and merchant slips and those weird margin doodles monks love. You've even copied a few, just for fun. You thought it was harmless, but now it feels like evidence. Marin moves on, and you stand there for a moment too long, staring at the apples in your basket, like they'll offer moral guidance. They don't. They're just bruised and overpriced. When you finally walk home, the road feels steeper. The weight of knowledge, of literacy, of awareness, of having thoughts is heavier than any laundry sack, and you wonder if sleep would come easier if you just forgot, if you burned the scraps you've saved, erased the letters you've practiced, stop trying to remember how power works and why, but you won't, because once you know something, you can't unknow it, and that is both your punishment, and your rebellion. You dream that night, but not peacefully. It's the kind of dream where your legs won't move fast enough and the air is thick like soup. In it, Beata speaks, but no sound comes out. Her mouth moves, wide and desperate, but her words vanish before they hit your ears. You wake with your fists clenched around your blanket and your jaw sore from grinding. The fire's low. The room smells of old ashes and damp wool. A chicken pecks half-heartedly at your doorstep like it's trying to remind you the world outside hasn't changed. You stretch, you ache, you pretend not to dread the day, because today might be when Beata is questioned. The town doesn't post schedules for this kind of thing, obviously, but everyone sort of knows when the square is unusually clean, when the bailiff doesn't scowl for once, when the guards are there, but not doing anything. It's the quiet before the spectacle. You remember the last one? A man accused of stealing a relic. You never saw the relic. You never saw him take it, but you definitely saw him after the punishment, and you'd rather forget. He'd been placed in a device called the strappado, a charming medieval invention that's less punishment and more skeleton removal machine. Arms tied behind his back, lifted by a rope, and then dropped suddenly, not far, just enough to dislocate both shoulders. Sometimes they added weights to the ankles for flair. Historians still argue whether this was considered a form of interrogation or official discipline, which is like debating whether falling off a horse is travel. Either way, bones got rearranged and no relic ever showed up. Beata's crime, if you remember, was literacy, or defiance, or simply saying a man was wrong. You're not sure anymore. The line between crimes and inconveniences is pretty thin when you're female and breathing. You pass by her house on the way to the market. The shutters are open. That's unusual. Inside, everything looks normal. A pot, a stool, a shelf with some dried rosemary, and a cracked jug. But she's not there. A boy says she's been taken to the chapel, which is worse than it sounds, because in your town, the chapel isn't just for prayers. It's where decisions are made, behind closed doors, surrounded by candles and stained glass that make everything look holy, even when it's not. You think about going, just to stand nearby, to be present, but then you remember last time, when a woman screamed during one of the questionings, and the priest told the crowd it was just her soul resisting correction. You remember how people nodded, so you walk past. Instead, you find yourself wandering near the edge of town, where the tannery stinks and the river clogs with discarded skins and dye runoff. It's the one place you can breathe without being noticed. Ironically, no one lingers here unless they have to. You sit, and you think about the fact that torture wasn't always called torture. Sometimes it was divine persuasion, sometimes legal compulsion, sometimes just procedure. There's a story you once heard about a woman in Avignon who was accused of poisoning her husband. She denied it. She denied it again and again, so they used the boot. Imagine your foot inside a tight wooden frame. Now imagine wooden wedges being hammered into that frame, slowly crushing your bones millimeter by millimeter. The woman confessed after 6 hours, except, according to a friar's journal, she had already confessed before the torture even began, quietly, in private, but her confession lacked passion, so they needed her to say it louder, with conviction. While in pain, historians still argue whether the boot was primarily French or German in origin, like it matters, as if regional pride should apply to cruelty. But you're not in Avignon, you're here, and Beata is somewhere behind glass and incense, possibly inside one of those wooden chairs, possibly being asked the same question over and over until her voice cracks, or her ribs do. A chicken scuttles past your foot and startles you out of your spiral. You laugh one of those tired, ironic laughs that sounds a little too close to crying. You remember your mother saying, "Laughter is safer than rage." You didn't understand that as a child. You do now, because rage gets noticed, and noticed women get punished. There's a part of you that wants to write Beata's name somewhere, on a scrap of parchment, on a rock, on your skin, just so she's remembered, even if no one else speaks it after today. But then you remember how even writing was once suspect. How, in some towns, women caught with ink-stained fingers were labeled witches, not for casting spells, but for simply writing things down. Even knowledge was gendered. Fringe fact time in parts of 14th century Switzerland, women weren't allowed to own quills unless they were nuns. It wasn't law, it was custom. And customs were more dangerous than laws because they didn't need to be written down to be enforced. They just were. You sigh, and then you stand, because the sun is dipping low. And if you linger too long near the tannery, people will think you're either hiding something or looking for something. And either way, they'll talk. As you head home, a bell rings in the distance. Not the market bell, not the church bell, the little one, the quiet one, the one they use when something has ended. But no one wants to say what. You don't know if Beata's alive, or if she confessed, or if she's been released with new bruises and no reputation. But you know one thing, the world will move on. People will buy bread tomorrow. They'll complain about the weather. They'll step around the same stones in the road and avoid eye contact with her house. And you'll still be tired, still sore, still pretending that your mind isn't louder than your voice. But when you lie down tonight, you will imagine Beata again, not in pain, but in defiance, standing somewhere quiet, reading a letter aloud into the wind, her voice steady, her words sharp. And this time, in your dream, you hear them. You don't go near the chapel the next day. You don't ask about Beata. You don't need to. Her absence speaks louder than any whisper. No bread left on her windowsill, no smoke from her hearth, no thump of firewood on the floorboards, just a quiet house, still and hollow, like the air after thunder. You keep walking. The baker's wife gives you a look, half pity, half warning, as if your face has been too curious lately, as if thinking too hard might be contagious. You buy your bread with exact coin and offer no smile. On the way home, your path crosses the pillory. It stands, as always, in the square, two upright beams, one hinge, and a history of shame carved into the wood by fingernails and fury. People pass it without looking, but you look. Today it holds a boy, 12, maybe 13, snot drying on his upper lip, shirt torn, a crude sign around his neck that reads thief. He stole a turnip, they say, and not even a good one, a half-rotten one with a worm in it. But a turnip is a turnip, and laws are laws, and suffering is apparently free to distribute. This isn't rare. In medieval towns, public humiliation is as routine as sweeping the porch. It's a performance, a morality play acted out live, so everyone gets the message. Do wrong, and your neighbors will become your jury, your judge, and your personal heckling squad. The punishment itself, child's play. Literally, they let the village kids throw things at you. Old eggs, clumps of dirt, sometimes dung. It's not meant to injure, just to humiliate, to break you down slowly, one jeer at a time. Historians still argue whether the pillory was more effective as a deterrent or a display. Either way, it's cheaper than a jail cell and doesn't waste rope. You stand by for too long, long enough for the boy to notice you. His eyes meet yours, and you realize with a sick twist that you're not just a witness, you're part of it. Because your silence is part of it, because you're standing here and he's trapped there, and this is just what people do. So you leave. You take the long way home. You pass the inn, where an old man mutters something about the stocks being cleaner in his day. And it's true, stocks were simpler, less head movement, more leg cramp. Pillories were more versatile, like the medieval Swiss Army knife of disgrace. And yet, you'd still take the pillory over what came next, because some punishments weren't content with pain or shame. They wanted permanence. There's an old tale of a woman in York who insulted her husband publicly. In front of others, he complained. She denied it, so the town council ordered a punishment to teach her a lesson. They shaved her head and fitted her with the scold's bridle. It's not as charming as it sounds. Imagine a metal cage for your face. Now imagine it's strapped tight, locking your jaw closed. A tongue plate presses down, sometimes spiked, so that even if you wanted to speak, you couldn't. The punishment wasn't for violence or theft or sorcery. It was for talking too much. You walk with that knowledge in your gut like a stone. Because how many words have you swallowed today? How many truths have you chewed down, gritted your teeth, and buried deep? They say the bridle was sometimes paraded through town. A woman led on a chain like a dog. Children were encouraged to mock her. It was civic instruction, entertainment with a moral fringe tidbit. In parts of Scotland, the scold's bridle sometimes included a bell on top so people could hear the punishment coming. Can you imagine that? Your shame ringing ahead of you, giving people time to prepare their laughter. You turn down a side street. Fewer people, fewer eyes. Your chest is tight. Not from fear exactly, but from compression, like you've been holding your breath for a decade. There's a bench near the edge of the field. You sit and you think about how punishments were designed to outlive the pain. The pillory left bruises, but it also left reputations in tatters. The bridle silenced a woman once, but made sure she never spoke comfortably again. Branding was another one, burning symbols into skin. A P for prostitute, a T for thief, a permanent resume of failure, worn where anyone could see. And these were the merciful ones, because if you were lucky enough to be punished and live, you still had to be that punishment afterward. It never left you. It followed you, sat in your lap at dinner, hung over your bed at night. Historians still argue whether public punishments like these worked as crime deterrents or just satisfied the townspeople's thirst for spectacle. You suspect it was both, and maybe that's the scariest part, that people liked it. You watch the breeze ripple through the grass. It's gentle today, soft and directionless, like the world forgot to be cruel for a minute. You close your eyes, and you imagine the boy in the pillory finally being let out. You imagine someone, not you, not exactly, but someone like you, bringing him water, not saying a word, just handing it to him. And in that tiny moment, a kind of rebellion, because kindness isn't expected here, because mercy feels illegal, and yet there are always cracks in the wall, always moments of breath between the lashes. And maybe, just maybe, those moments are how people survived at all. You stand again, the sun's lower now, your shadow's longer. You walk home and pass the chapel once more, still quiet, still closed. No one speaks Beata's name, not even in whispers, but someone has left a flower on her doorstep, not a fancy one, just a dandelion, crushed slightly, but bright. You don't know who put it there, but you walk a little slower, because maybe that's how it begins. Maybe mercy is louder than bells. Your feet know the way home, even when your thoughts drift far beyond the crooked alleys and soot-smudged windows. You pass a woman drawing water from the well. Her hands are cracked, red with cold. Even though spring is supposedly in full swing, she doesn't nod. You don't speak. You just notice how heavy the bucket looks, and how long her sleeves are covering something, or hiding it. You head inside and latch the door. But tonight, there's no sleep waiting behind the shutters, just the knowledge that tomorrow might bring something worse, or nothing at all, which, in some ways, is heavier. You lie awake thinking about that dandelion on Beata's doorstep. You wonder if it's still there, or if the wind has carried it off into the dark. Maybe that's for the best. It wouldn't last long in this place, because here, even sleep is political. You've probably noticed by now people don't seem well rested in the Middle Ages. That's not just the smoke in the air or the lack of goose-down pillows. It's what sleep means. See, sleep was never private. Not really. You share your sleeping space with parents, siblings, neighbors, sometimes animals. Privacy isn't a luxury. It's a fantasy, a foolish one. Beds, if you're lucky enough to have one, are small and lumpy, usually stuffed with straw, and that straw is crawling with more nightlife than the local tavern. Fleas, lice, beetles. They don't sleep, they party. And the bed, you don't own it. Not exactly. You share it, rotationally, with guests, extended family, or visiting monks. You'd be amazed how often monks turned up uninvited. But here's the twist. People didn't sleep the way we do now. Mainstream historical fact, in the medieval world, segmented sleep was the norm. You'd have a first sleep after sunset, wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two, then drift into second sleep before dawn. That middle period was often used for prayer, sex, light housework, or, hilariously, stealing food from the larder if you were especially bold. It wasn't insomnia, it was just the routine. Fringe tidbit. Some medical texts of the time suggested that this break between sleep phases was healthy for the humors, as if melatonin took a polite tea break in the middle of the night, and you lie there, awake in the middle of your first or second sleep, who knows anymore, and think about the other side of this. Because while you stare at the ceiling beams, you remember a girl named Elspeth who once confessed her dreams. Not dreams as in aspirations, those were crushed long ago, but literal dreams. Vivid ones, frightening ones, ones with flying demons and burning wheels and a shadow that whispered her name from the treetops. She told someone, and that someone told someone else. The priest came. They asked her many questions about what she'd eaten, about who her parents were, about whether she'd read any strange books. She hadn't. Then they asked if she'd seen a man in her dreams, black cloak, no eyes, coy. She said yes. Big mistake, because now she wasn't dreaming. She was consorting. You never saw her again. Historians still argue whether such accusations were rooted in genuine fear or used as excuses for removing inconvenient women. Honestly, it doesn't matter when you're the one on the receiving end. Even sleep isn't yours. Even your dreams can be evidence. You shift under your thin blanket and trace a line on the wood with your finger. The room is dark, but not empty. In the medieval night, darkness isn't a void. It's busy, full of sounds, owls, rats, someone coughing down the alley, something or someone splashing in the stream. You hope it's just someone. You roll over and think about sleep punishments. Yes, that's a thing. Take the ordeal of wakeful penance, a form of medieval punishment where a sinner, usually a woman, was forced to stand or kneel for hours through the night, reciting prayers without rest. No food, no water, just endless repetitions of guilt and salvation until the knees gave out or the soul broke open. It was called purification. Sounds cozy, right? Worse still, sometimes the sleep deprivation was intentional and communal. Whole villages might be kept awake by bells, by ritual, by fear of what dreams might invite in, because what entered your sleep could reveal your secrets. And if your secrets weren't clean, well, you were basically a lit match in a hay barn. You finally managed to drift off, but even your dreams feel borrowed. You dream of corridors with no end, of people walking backward, of a bridle hanging from a hook that whispers your name. You wake up sweating, the blanket twisted around you like rope. The fire has gone out. Your breath clouds in the air. You sit up. Wait. Listen. Silence, but not the comforting kind. The kind that watches you. You wrap the blanket tighter, your knees tucked close. You remember an old woman once said that sleep was God's mercy given nightly. You're not so sure anymore. It doesn't feel like mercy. It feels like surveillance. And there's something deeply sad about a world where even rest has rules, where you're not safe even in your dreams, where every closed eye might still be judged. You lie back down, try again. The rats in the walls resume their scuffle. You imagine they're arguing over a crumb, maybe a bit of that worm turnip from the square. Even they know how precious food is. Even they don't waste. You wish you could be a rat, just for one night, small, unnoticed, sleeping wherever you like. No one expects a rat to confess its sins. Eventually, your eyes grow heavy again. You let go of the day, let go of Beata, the pillory, the dreams, the bridle, the shadows, the priest, the boy with the turnip, the whispering hook, and somehow, through the ache, through the chill, you manage to sleep again. Or maybe you just disappear for a while. That counts too. You awake to the soft, gray light of dawn filtering through the wooden slats of your room, the smell of damp earth mingling with the faint smoke from a distant hearth. Your body aches from the night's restless turning, but the day doesn't wait for comfort, does it? You stretch stiff limbs and remind yourself that the Middle Ages had more than their fair share of peculiar remedies for sleeplessness, especially for women like you who struggle to find rest without fear or interruption. One popular prescription was the humble herbal pillow, stuffed with chamomile, lavender, and valerian roots, plants known even then for their calming properties. You might have nestled your weary head atop one, hoping its scent would lull you to a peaceful sleep, but the idea of herbal pillows wasn't purely medicinal. It also carried an element of superstition. People believed that certain herbs could ward off evil spirits that prowled the night, restless and hungry for souls who dared to close their eyes. You think about the countless women who relied on these makeshift sleep aids, some simple, some more elaborate. There were charms sewn into nightcaps, ritualistic bedtime prayers whispered to saints, and even the use of sleeping potions, often little more than diluted alcohol or mixtures of mandrake and opium, administered by wise women or dubious healers. The latter, of course, was a double-edged sword. Too much, and you might slip into an eternal sleep rather than a restorative one. It's striking how intimately sleep was tied to both medicine and magic. Mainstream historical fact tells us that medieval medicine still leaned heavily on the theory of humors, believing that imbalance caused sleeplessness, especially among women thought to be naturally moist or cold. Treating insomnia was a delicate matter of restoring balance, often through diet, bloodletting, or simple rest. But here's a quirky detail. Some medieval remedies for sleep included the peculiar practice of blood drawing from the feet or ears, places thought to harbor excess humors, disrupting the body's natural rhythms. Imagine explaining that at a modern doctor's office. Historians still debate how widespread and effective these treatments were. Did herbal pillows genuinely help, or were they just comforting rituals that provided a psychological balm? And to what extent did fear of demons, of punishment, of social ostracism, play a role in keeping women awake, no matter the remedy? You glance at the small, worn book lying on your bedside bench, its pages filled with faded recipes and prayers, a testament to the centuries-old struggle for a good night's rest. Maybe tomorrow you'll try that lavender sachet. For now, the day beckons. The market awaits with its clatter and chatter, the fields with their endless toil, and the church bells with their steady tolling, a reminder that even rest is never far from labor and faith. You stand, rub the sleep from your eyes, and prepare to face another day in a world where sleep was both a refuge and a battleground. The morning sun streams through the narrow windows as you step into the bustling village square, where the chatter of merchants and the braying of livestock fill the air. Today's work will be no different, but beneath the surface of everyday life lies an unspoken tension, especially for women like you, whose days are weighed down not only by chores, but by the heavy burden of societal expectations and harsh consequences for any perceived missteps. Punishments for women accused of disrupting social order were often wrapped in the guise of discipline, but carried a sharp sting of humiliation and fear. Take the brank, for instance, also known as the scold's bridle. This iron muzzle, fitted tightly over the head with a gag pressing against the tongue, was designed to silence outspoken women, those accused of nagging or gossiping too freely. You can almost feel the cold metal biting into the skin, the helplessness as the device clipped shut, rendering speech impossible. It's a grim but oddly fascinating chapter in history, how speech itself was policed with such severity. The brank was not only punishment, but a public spectacle, paraded through the village to shame its wearer. You might have seen a neighbor dragged down the street, head held low, the metal contraption rattling with every step. Yet, there's a strange paradox here. While meant to suppress, it also highlighted women's power, the fear their voices could inspire. Beyond the brank, other punishments included public shaming rituals, such as the ducking stool, where a woman accused of gossip or unruliness was tied to a chair and repeatedly dunked into a river or pond. The thought alone is enough to make you shiver. But oddly, some believe the cold water had a cleansing effect, washing away sins and restoring order. A curious fringe tidbit: Certain villages had variations of these punishments that involved placing the accused woman in a cage or atop a pillory, exposed to the jeers of passers-by, but also to the elements, a form of punishment blending humiliation with discomfort. Imagine falling asleep in such a cage if sleep came at all. Historians still argue whether these punishments were primarily about controlling speech or if they reflected deeper anxieties about women's roles in society and the fragile nature of community harmony. Were these devices merely tools of suppression, or did they also reveal a grudging respect for the influence women held? As you navigate through the crowd, you catch a glimpse of the village blacksmith, hammering away, the rhythmic clang echoing like a heartbeat. Life goes on, but beneath its steady pulse lies a history shaped by voices, silence, and freedoms curtailed, a reminder that even in times of hardship, the fight for autonomy and dignity was quietly ongoing. You tuck this thought away as you move toward the fields, the day stretching out before you, both familiar and fraught with the weight of unspoken stories. You trudge along the muddy path to the town hall, a modest stone building that feels more like a cage than a place of justice. Here, women accused of various offenses, often minor or imagined face trials that are as much about spectacle as fairness. The medieval legal system, you soon learn, was an unpredictable beast, especially when it came to gender. For you, the courtroom is a place of tension, where every word you say might be twisted, and the weight of suspicion rests heavily. Punishments could be swift and severe, with little room for defense. One common sentence for women accused of moral failings or minor crimes was public whipping. The whip cracked through the air, not only inflicting pain, but serving as a stark warning to others. The ritual humiliation often mattered more than the physical punishment, a quirky detail to imagine sometimes. These public punishments were accompanied by symbolic gestures, like making the woman wear a special colored cloth or a sign that branded her offense for all to see. This way, even after the whipping, the shame lingered, woven into daily life. Interestingly, historians debate whether these public punishments were intended more for the community's benefit than the offender's correction. Was the spectacle meant to reinforce social order or to genuinely reform behavior? You might notice how the crowd's mood shifts between morbid curiosity and a kind of communal catharsis. Now, picture this in some places. Women accused of witchcraft or heresy were subjected to a bizarre form of trial involving the weighing of their bodies. The belief was that witches were unnaturally light, so if you weighed less than expected, that was proof of guilt. You'd likely find this practice utterly baffling and maybe a bit comical if it weren't so grim. The tension between superstition and law is palpable, making the courtroom feel like a crossroads between reason and fear. You might wonder how any woman could sleep peacefully with such threats hanging over her head. As you leave the hall, the chatter of townsfolk buzzes around you, some sympathizing, others eager for scandal. It's a world where justice is entwined with spectacle, and where the thin line between order and cruelty is often blurred. You find yourself in the dim, flickering light of a medieval chamber, where the sleep of women is disrupted not only by worries, but by deliberate, cruel devices designed to torment and control. Sleep deprivation was sometimes used as a punishment or even a form of torture, aimed at breaking spirits and forcing confessions. Imagine lying awake for nights on end, the silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the faint rustle of rats in the corners. One mainstream historical fact to hold on to: medieval authorities sometimes kept prisoners awake by waking them repeatedly or forcing them to sit in uncomfortable positions, some even strapped to chairs designed to prevent sleep. The mental fog, the creeping exhaustion, these were weapons just as sharp as any blade. A quirky tidbit to imagine: there were reports of scolds' bridles, iron cages strapped around the heads of women accused of gossiping or witchcraft, which also made sleep nearly impossible. These devices were sometimes fitted with spikes inside the mouthpiece to punish speaking, but also made closing one's eyes for peaceful rest a challenge. You'd probably think that's one of the most uncomfortable sleep masks ever invented. Historians still argue whether sleep deprivation was used systematically as a form of punishment or if it was more a side effect of harsh prison conditions. Some believe chronic sleeplessness led to mental breakdowns that were then recorded as signs of guilt or madness, a cruel cycle of interpretation and abuse. Now, imagine the paradox of this world, a society that highly valued religion and the symbolic purity of rest, yet frequently disrupted women's sleep as a form of control. Sleep, a natural refuge, was weaponized against them. You might find it unsettling to think about how many women were haunted by such relentless wakefulness, their dreams stolen night after night. And yet, in the quiet moments when sleep did come, some women reportedly used herbal concoctions like valerian root or lavender to soothe themselves, mixing old wisdom with desperate hope. The science of sleep medicine was, of course, centuries away. As you close your eyes, you might reflect on how this sad history of sleep deprivation reveals a broader pattern, the control of bodies and minds, extending even into the realm of rest. It's a reminder that what seems natural and peaceful today was once a contested battleground, especially for women navigating the precarious world of the Middle Ages. You drift from the harsh chambers of sleepless nights into the softer, though no less troubled, world of medieval women's dreams and rituals around sleep. Despite the cruelty and control, sleep was also a deeply spiritual and symbolic act, intertwined with hopes, fears, and a desire for healing. You sense the flickering candlelight of small bedrooms, the whispers of prayers murmured before bed, and the faint scent of herbs tucked under pillows. One mainstream historical fact: medieval women often engaged in bedtime prayers and rituals meant to ward off nightmares or evil spirits because, back then, the night was a mysterious realm full of unseen dangers. Some women kept protective amulets or charms near their beds, a practice reflecting a blend of Christian faith and older folk beliefs. A quirky tidbit to ponder: some women reportedly slept with dreamstones, smooth pebbles believed to encourage pleasant dreams or prophetic visions. The idea of sleeping with a tiny magical rock under your pillow feels like an early version of a comfort object, almost like the medieval equivalent of a modern weighted blanket. Historians still argue whether these sleep rituals were more about genuine belief or psychological comfort, and how much of the folklore was a subtle form of resistance against harsher realities. Were these practices quiet acts of self-care or desperate attempts to reclaim agency in a controlled life? You also discover that the medieval night was a liminal space where women might experience visions or revelations, sometimes medical, sometimes spiritual, that influenced their waking lives. In a world where formal education was rare for women, dreams could serve as a source of knowledge or insight, even if filtered through superstition. As you lie back and feel the imagined weight of a soft blanket, the contrast between the night as a time of terror and a sanctuary becomes clear. Sleep was both a battleground and a refuge. It carried the weight of societal pressures and personal hopes alike. Before your eyes close fully, you might imagine the paradoxical comfort and fear woven into medieval women's nights, reminders that even in history's darker moments, the human spirit seeks peace, however fleeting. Now, as you settle deeper into the quietude of the medieval night, your thoughts turn to the aftermath of all this restless tossing and turning, how the legacy of sleep deprivation and societal control shaped not only individual women's lives, but entire communities. You picture the slow dawn light spilling over villages where mothers, daughters, and grandmothers rise, often worn thin, but carrying on the rhythms imposed by a world that rarely saw their struggles. One well-known historical fact: chronic sleep deprivation in medieval times was linked to increased vulnerability to illness and mental strain, conditions that compounded the hardships faced by women in a patriarchal society. The constant fear and physical toll made even daily chores feel monumental, shaping gender roles and expectations in subtle yet pervasive ways. A less commonly discussed detail: some medieval texts suggest that women developed early forms of herbal remedies specifically to aid sleep, mixtures of valerian, lavender, and mugwort, used not only for rest but also for calming anxiety or easing the pains of childbirth. These remedies hint at a hidden knowledge and quiet rebellion against the harshness of their lives. Historians still debate how much these early sleep aids truly helped versus how much they served as symbolic acts of self-care or faith in a better night to come. The overlap between medicine, superstition, and gender roles is a murky but fascinating space, revealing how medieval women navigated their limited options. As you drift toward the end of this long night's journey, you might imagine the gentle embrace of sleep finally arriving, softening the edges of pain, fear, and fatigue. If only for a few hours. The medieval woman's sleep, though often troubled, was also a fleeting refuge, a small sanctuary in a world that demanded so much. So, as the candle burns low and the morning light inches closer, you let go of the past's harsh whispers, settling into a calm hush. Tomorrow brings its own challenges, but for now, the quiet night cradles you gently, a reminder that even through history's darkest stories, moments of peace can be found. Now, slowing your breath, feel the weight of your body sink deeper into softness. The faint murmur of night sounds carries you gently away from the unrest of history, easing the edges of every tale told tonight. Let the quiet settle over you like a warm, familiar blanket. Rest easy, knowing that the struggles of the past are behind you now, and the calm of the present night is all around. With every soft breath, you drift further from the worries of yesterday and closer to the gentle embrace of peaceful sleep. Let your mind float on quiet dreams, untethered by fear or pain. Soon, you will wake refreshed, carrying only the softest echoes of these stories, wrapped safely in the calm light of a new day. Good night, dear listener.